الفساد. فالمادة 6 من اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد بتتكلم على هيئات وقائية لمكافحة الفساد. وجت المادة 36 من الاتفاقية تكميلية للمادة رقم 6. فجت تتكلم على إن كل دولة طرف ممكن إنها أو يجب بمعنى أصح إنها تضمن وجود هيئة أو هيئات متخصصة تقوم بمكافحة الفساد. يعني لو كانت المادة الأولى بتتكلم عن وظائف وقائية، فالمادة الثانية بتتكلم عن وظائف علاجية، ضمانات للتدخل القضائي والقانوني لمكافحة الفساد. وفي الحقيقة إن اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد ما جاتش هي لوحدها عشان تقول كده، لا ده جت بعدها كمان الاتفاقية العربية لمكافحة الفساد في مادتها رقم 10 عشان تقول إن الدول الأطراف يجب إنها تكفل وجود هيئة أو هيئات تتولى منع ومكافحة الفساد. فالاتفاقية العربية لمكافحة الفساد حاولت إنها تجمع بين الوظائف العلاجية والوقائية لهيئات مكافحة الفساد. ما بين وجود هيئة واحدة مركزية لمكافحة الفساد دي تجربة في طريق الأردن واليمن والعراق وتونس مؤخرا، أو وجود هيئات مختلفة، وما بين إنها تتولى أدوار وقائية أو تتولى أدوار علاجية. إزاي نشوف آليات التطبيق؟ إيه هي أفضل آليات التطبيق؟ وإزاي نتفادى المشكلات اللي طرحها الأستاذ دكتور أحمد صقر عاشور في الجلسة الأولى واللي أكد عليها بعد كده أستاذ زين العلي، زي مثلا عدم وضوح العلاقة الأساسية بين الهيئة المركزية لمكافحة الفساد والهيئات الأخرى، أو إن الهيئة المركزية لمكافحة الفساد ما هياش جزء من مبادرة شاملة لمكافحة الفساد في المجتمع، أو إنها استقلاليات ضعيفة، أو إنها عندها محدودية في الصلاحيات وفي الأدوار، أو لديها ضعف في الموارد، أو عند في غياب الإرادة السياسية اللي بتدي لهيئة مكافحة الفساد دور قوي تضمن لها في المجتمع. عن أفضل آليات التطبيق وعن الكيسز الموجودة في الأمر في الحياة الواقعية هيكلمنا في الجلسة دي الأستاذ جوناثان أجار والسيد فريدريك أريكسون. مستر جوناثان أجار هو مسؤول الجريمة والعدالة الجنائية في مكتب الأمم المتحدة المعني بالمخدرات والجريمة، وهو شارك في تقديم تكنيكال اسيستنس أو دعم فني في مشروعات كتيرة جدا لمكافحة الفساد في العراق وليبيا وفي مصر، وأنا شخصيا عملت معاه فيما يتعلق بالاستراتيجية الوطنية لمكافحة الفساد وأيضا في آليات الاستعراض. أيضا يتحدث إلينا السيد فريدريك أريكسون خبير الدولي في مكافحة الفساد، وهو عمل في الكثير من وكالات الأمم المتحدة وخصوصا برنامج الإنمائي للأمم المتحدة، وعمل أيضا في الصين والنرويج وليتوانيا وروسيا وإندونيسيا، وأنا حضرت له ورش عمل كتير جدا، وهو حقيقة to the point ودايركت وبيدينا المعلومة صح. فلو حد عنده سؤال في الصميم هو هيجاوب عليه إن شاء الله. نبدأ الجلسة بالسيد جوناثان.
Thank you, Dr. Herring. I noticed you very explicitly said I was not to the point, so I'll try and be as brief and to the point as I can this afternoon. But firstly, let me say it's a real pleasure to be addressing you this afternoon. I'm Jonathan Agar, of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime based in Vienna, and we act as the Global Secretariat, the Global Advisory Service for every country that signs the UN Convention Against Corruption. So when you sign on the dotted line as a country on the UN Convention Against Corruption, we are the body that you come to for advice about how best to go about implementing the requirements of the Convention. And it's in my capacity as an advisor in that regard that I'm here today to set the context for our discussions. In some of the presentations we've heard already this morning and this afternoon, there's been reference made to the UN Convention Against Corruption, Article 6 and Article 36. But what I want to try and do is get into a little bit of detail about specifically what do those provisions of the Convention require of states parties when they sign on the dotted line. So as Egypt has done, what is Egypt required to do under the Convention? That's my first part, that's what I want to outline. But then secondly, I want to try and outline to you some examples, some experiences of other countries in implementing those provisions of the Convention. We are in a very privileged position in Vienna to have countries come to us and to have the ability to go and work with all 167 countries that have signed the Convention to collect good practices in this area. So in this presentation, which I promised to limit to 10 minutes from here on in, I'm going to try and outline what you're required to do, so we know this when we're discussing this issue. And then secondly, how have other countries gone about trying to address this issue? And what are the general lessons we can learn in terms of what are the priorities you should have when implementing these provisions? So, to begin with, maybe a little introduction to the convention itself. What is the convention and why should you care about it when you're addressing the issue of anti-corruption agencies? Well, as you can see from the map, the first reason that it matters is because it is a truly global instrument. 167 countries have now signed the convention. It's one of the most rapidly signed conventions in the history of international instruments. If you go onto the United Nations website now and look at the kind of top 20 most ratified conventions, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption is in there, and that's bearing in mind that it only came into force in 2005, really as a reflection that the international community has said, yes, this is the framework, the global framework we want to use when implementing the convention. So you can see from the map, all the countries that are in blue in that map have signed the convention, have ratified the convention. And there's the occasional bits of orange and red of those countries that have either just signed or countries that have not signed at all and not ratified either. So the countries in this region, the vast majority of countries have ratified the convention and are bound by it. Now, when I introduce the convention, I usually use three words. One is global. The reason I say that, of course, is because the majority of countries in the world have ratified the convention. But the second word I use is comprehensive. When I say comprehensive, I mean in the terms of the substantive areas that the convention covers. This is the key advantage of this convention over any other international instrument, because it addresses these key four areas. And I've outlined them there in relation to each chapter. One, prevention, preventive measures. So what are the measures you should take? And it's a good governance chapter, ultimately. What are the measures you can take in government to reduce the opportunities of corruption arising? So we're talking about public procurement, we're talking about integrity in the judiciary, we're talking about civil service recruitment systems and the management of the civil service. All these measures are contained in Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is on criminalisation. What are the criminal offences you should put in place in relation to corruption? There was an interesting discussion briefly before about, well, how do you define corruption? How should we go about defining corruption? Interestingly, under the UN Convention Against Corruption, the word corruption is not defined. There is no corruption is this. Instead, there are a series of individual offences that together constitute acts of corruption. Partly this is because there was no agreement on the specific wording of what corruption should be, but also it's a reflection of the fact that corruption is an extremely broad range of actions. And rather than worrying about how we define it, it instead looks at the specific offences that come underneath that term. Chapter 4 is on international cooperation, so extradition and mutual legal assistance. Just very good, interestingly on Chapter 4, the Convention actually provides the legal basis for cooperation. So if you as Egypt want to extradite somebody from a country with whom you do not normally have an extradition agreement, and you both signed the Convention Against Corruption, you can use the Convention as that legal basis. It's a practical tool that you can use, and that's something I always want to try and get across. This is not just a list of promises you'll make each other. In many senses, this is a practical tool that you can use in your fight against corruption. And then finally, there's the chapter on asset recovery, probably the most innovative and interesting section of the Convention. I know it's parts of the fight against corruption that Egypt is particularly interested in. And again, this chapter provides the legal basis on which you can recover assets from other countries. Okay, so that's the general introduction. I want to talk to you about the specific provisions of the Convention that relate to exactly what we're talking about today. Article 6 of the Convention provides as follows, and it's important we think about actually what is the specific wording, what is the specific obligation that Egypt is under when we're talking about these issues. It states as follows. States must ensure the existence of a body or bodies that prevent corruption.